So hey, welcome to this week's Wednesday office hours stream thing. Again, my sincere apologies, but I'm not feeling particularly well today. However, last week I felt better after I did the stream, so we're gonna do the same thing we did last week, where we're gonna just keep going until I, collapse in quotes. I'm not ready to collapse, but if I have to end it early, we just will. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to post them in on Slack, and yeah, we'll get started whenever anybody has a question. Oh, Latin var. Yes. Yeah, we could go through. The only reason I hesitate is that you might notice that there is a very specific tenor to the way that I've organized this prep course, and it's because there's a ton of different ways to do everything in JavaScript. So if you were to try to learn all of them at the exact same time, it might be a little bit much. However, I haven't seen any other questions, so let's talk about the difference between var and let. At a very high level, there is very few differences between let and var. So whenever you're looking to answer a question like this, a good initial step can be to just check out to see what Google says. We'll say let versus var JavaScript. And the reason I'm showing you this is because we're going to start with a very unorganized version of this, and then we're going to show a practical example or two. So, let's see. The let statement declares a block-scoped local variable, optionally initializing it to a value. So, okay. Let allows you to describe variables that are limited to the scope of a block statement or expression on which it was used, unlike the var keyword, which defines a variable globally or locally to an entire function regardless of block scope. The other difference between var and let is that the latter is initialized to a value only when a parser evaluates it. Oh, geez. Okay, so usually the first thing that we do when we read something like this and we're beginners is it's like, I have no idea what any of that means. So they give us some tests. The problem with this is that we have to understand scope first. And the idea is that you could think of it as a variable, but you also could think of it as a binding between a name and a value that that name represents. And scope has to do with where that binding is applicable. So let's go ahead and grab these, go ahead and come over to Replit and see if we can figure it out. Oh, see, this is why I hate the examples on pages like this. Not that MDN isn't an excellent resource, but nobody really knows why they would put this here. They created a block scope that doesn't really have anything to do with anything. It's just a block. The problem with that is that nobody who's a beginner would have any idea that you could even do that or why you would want to. So yeah, that's one problem. Yeah, I don't like these. We're going to start with for loops. So we're going to do two for loops. I is less than 4, I plus plus. Oh geez, go back. And okay, so here's a really simple description of the difference between the two, keeping in mind that they are very, very similar. So we're going to comment out this one. So what we've done is we've created a variable I, set it equal to 0, bound it to be less than, actually we haven't bound it, we've conditioned it to be less than 4 for the duration of the for loop, and then I++ just means increment each time that it goes. I see you on the chat, we'll do that next. Console log I, and so what's going to happen is it's going to log the value of I here, and then we're going to log the value of I afterwards. So we're also going to add in a quick little during iteration. And if you've never done that, it's a really easy way to put nice little labels next to your console.log statements. And then after iteration. Okay. So if we run this, what we're going to see is it's going to say 1, 2, 3. Well, no, it's going to say 0, 1, 2, 3. And then afterwards, it's going to say 3. Oh, geez, 4. Okay, sorry. It's going to say 4 afterwards. And the reason is that I breaks this condition when I get set to 4 after the last iteration. But because we've used var, I is not scoped to this for loops block. And the for loop block is only just what's in on line 2. That's the block of code inside of which I has a value of 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then eventually 4. But it's not bound to that block, meaning on line 5, we still have access to this variable I. And as you can see, it's when it gets set to 4, that's when the iteration stops, so that's why it looks like that. The difference between that and this let version is that let allows us to bind the value of I to be valid only within the for loops block. So let me show you what I mean. This is one of those where demonstration and examples do a way better job than just freelance explaining. But with a concept like this, you always want to get as many explanations as you can and mess it up a couple times yourself. And then it'll start to stick because it's more like practiced memory than it is memorization. Okay, so what's going to happen here is we're going to console.log during iteration. It's going to look exactly the same. When it gets to line 11, something different is going to happen. It says I is not defined. So that's the difference between let and var. Var will not bind it to a for loop scope. And the same thing with an if statement. So anytime you have like a, some kind of keyword, if some condition, and then this, lines 14 to 16, this is the block. And so what we can do is let allows you to bind a variable's value to within a block that's not a function. That's pretty much it. It's something that's available in other languages, and people got sick of JavaScript not being able to do that, so they added it in. I can keep going on that, but the difference between let and var is just so unimportant for passing the interview that I usually try to skip it, because once you get a good understanding of how to use var, understanding how to use let is much easier, because it's building on a foundation of practice knowledge, as opposed to just being like, hey, here's a thing called var and here's another thing called let. They work almost identically, except for in situations that do with a concept that you also don't know about yet. To me, it seems excellent. Person who asked that is good. If anybody else needs any more explanations about that, I would highly advise you start doing the Googling thing first. Not that you didn't do that, and always feel free to ask questions during office hours, but even after I give an explanation, you always want to go in and try to Google it and read it yourself. And even if you don't get it when I explain it and you don't get it when you read it, it might be the case that third time, because you read about it and because you heard somebody discuss it and saw an example or two, it clicks, just because you're finally like, oh, okay, I get it. So, excellent question though. Let and var is one of those things that keeps me up at night, because I wrote the entire course with var before thinking that, man, I really probably should have used let. But there's an eloquent JavaScript read-through on this YouTube channel that goes into let and the differences, and everything in there is let. Yeah, it does. It's one of those where you are training as a software engineer to both create new projects and maintain old ones. So I didn't want people to exit the prep course without a knowledge of what var is. And to me, it's easier to go var to let than it is let to var. So there you go. Let's see. Could you explain when you would do the following? If array I.length is greater than largest.length, and if array at I is greater than largest. Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this question into Replit, just because, just because. So that's a multi-line comment. That's going to allow me to write multiple lines of comments. Hi, can you please explain the following? Do the following if, okay, so if, this one is usually going to be a situation where a couple things are happening. We are probably trying to find the longest string. So what we might do would be set the largest, we probably wouldn't call it largest, but you might call the largest string or something with a length property and set that equal to the value largest. And then you might have a string, this R, that's full of strings, or sorry, an array, this R, that's full of strings, and we might be trying to see which one is the longest. So let's see if we can set that up real quick. We'll say var R is equal to A, B, C, D. And so we want to find which of these is the largest. So what we might do is iterate over this array, and then for each value in it, we might say something like variable largest is equal to A, or an empty string, doesn't really matter. And then we might do something like, I just say we might do something. We're going to do something, because we're actually doing it. Less than array.length. Go on then. So this would be something like we iterate over the array. We check to see if the current value's length is greater than the largest length. And if it is, we would probably reassign largest to be equal to array at I. And then depending on the constraints of the problem, we would either at the very end of this, and we're picturing all of this as wrapped in a function, but we would do something like return largest, or maybe largest.length. It really depends on what the question is asking for. For the second one, array at I is greater than largest, picture these are values. We'll just copy and paste. Let's say that we'll just return largest here. And because this is going to be a situation where we are comparing a property of the values rather than the values themselves. So a situation where the second version would be the most effective option would be one where these are not strings, but maybe like numbers. I want to find the largest number in this. And this would be the case. Largest, we might want to set it equal to 0. If we know that there are no negative, we might set it to negative infinity. Or we might just set it to the first value in the array. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. And then keeping in mind again that this would all be wrapped inside of a function, because you can't just say return in the middle of a statement or in the middle of your code. But yeah, this would be one where we're say array at I is greater than largest. So that's why it would be greater than rather than the actual values rather than comparing the lengths, is because it has to do with the comparison and then the reassignment of whatever we want the largest to be. And it mostly has to do with the constraints of what the problem is asking you. If it's asking you for the length of the longest one, if it's asking you for the longest string, if it's asking you for the largest number, all of that's really going to depend on why we use different if statements for either situation. Good question though. A lot of people trick that up, and almost invariably you'll do a version of this where you do everything properly and then write .length when you don't mean it, or you'll reassign here. A lot of people do this where they set largest equal to array at I.length. Then the next time they go through, it'll be like, hey, can't get length property of undefined. And what that means is that it's like largest, instead of being a string, is now like 4, like the number 4. And so if we say 4.length, it's like, hey, I can't get that. Oh, thank you. Honestly, let and I have a bit of a sore spot with each other, just because I learned JavaScript right before let came out, and it was heartbreaking. It's like, why did I learn all of this var nonsense, and then you're going to come out with something cool like let right afterwards? For those of you who have made it into pre-course, you're going to know what I'm talking about. There's a function that they have you do where you check a credit card, you like verify a credit card numbers, and you do it for a series of numbers between 2 different values, but you call a function inside of there. And what ends up happening is that if you use let, it saves the value of I for each call of the function, but if you don't use let, it doesn't because of the asynchronous nature of JavaScript, and so you end up having to do something called an immediately invoked function expression, which nobody ever knows about when they see that problem, and it's a question everybody gets wrong when they go through pre-course. Let doesn't have that problem. Let basically means that the value of I is going to be bound to that iteration of the for loop, rather than just, whenever the function inside of the for loop gets called, which is very, very important when you get to more complicated, problems. But one more, can you please show how to use console.log to test when debugging? Absolutely. So let's pick one of these to just do. We'll go with largest number. And okay, we're going to say function get largest value. It's going to take in correctly spelled value, and then array of numbers. What do we call it? R. Let's just leave it as R. All right, let's see if Replit wants to get along. A lot of text editors will let you tab. It does. If you hit Command and then the square bracket to the right and the left when you're highlighting, you can tab out like a whole group of stuff. Very, very nice if you ever find that you need to wrap things in a function. How long do you plan on holding office hours? Ooh, sorry, I meant to not answer questions before I answer the first one because I'm very, very easily distracted. But that seems like a useful question. So for everybody, do you mean how long tonight or how long like in general in future? And we'll come back to that when that answer comes back. So let's say that we did this wrong. Let's say that we did .length here, and so we've got a problem. So we're going to call get largest value on input. We'll console.log it. We're also going to need an input in a second here, but we've got one. So we'll call this input. Okay, we probably spelled something wrong, but that's okay. So let's run and see what happens. Undefined. Okay, so I think that I should be getting back the value 21, but I'm getting back the value undefined. So when, today I usually hold them for about an hour, or as long as it takes until I get tired, and then for the other one, I don't know. It depends, because I'm not really supposed to technically be doing it. I just kind of told somebody I was going to, and they let me. So eventually they might find out that I'm still doing it, and they'll be like, oh, we'll want somebody else to do that, because I have like another job that I'm supposed to be up to. But so as long as they let me, I would imagine would be the answer to that. I thoroughly enjoy this, so, you know, hopefully that's a sufficient answer. But if they don't, I'll keep posting stuff on the YouTube channel, because, well, I feel like some people are finding it useful. Anyway, so we got undefined. We don't want undefined. We want largest, and largest should be 21. So before we set it equal to infinity, and what is usually a good idea to do here is to console.log the value that we return and see why it's not equal to like negative infinity or one of the values, because it's equal to undefined. That's kind of weird. So we'll say we'll say during iteration, and we write a string. And so console.log will let you separate values that you want to log to the console with a space if you enter them with a comma. So it's basically like a parameter list, or like an argument list, I should say. So this is the first argument to console.log, and then I'm going to write a comma and just write another as though I was calling a function, and I am. Console.log, you know, as a function, and it's going to take, in this case, 2 arguments. The first one's going to be a string. The second one's going to be a value that I want that string to be a descriptor for, and that's why I say during iteration and then do largest. Now, I'm saying during iteration because I'm only logging one value to the console. If I had more values logged into the console, I might say something like largest during iteration. Are you using VS Code? I am not using VS Code. Hack Reactor Galvanize, VS Code is the go-to text editor. Same thing, I'm a curmudgeon, and so like my limit of new text editors to learn was 3, and I learned Sublime, and then somebody maybe used brackets for a little while, and then Atom is what galvanized curriculum developers use, so I don't really feel like learning VS Code anymore at this point. I will at some point, I just, you know, I don't like change. But that said, this is Replit. This is a totally free website. Easily lets you spin up really small projects with a ton of different languages. Very, very useful. They were also personally helpful to me and the prep team a while ago. They let us house our course on here while they were working on their course housing technology, and they let us leave it there for much longer than they needed to. So very, very big fan of Replit, and you know, feel free to use it if you'd like. Thank you in the chat. That's also awesome. When y'all help each other out, that's the best version of this. And then after iteration. So to the person who asked this question, I'm sorry it's been so stunted, which is to say we've kind of delved off into different avenues while we're answering this question, but this is essentially what we're doing. We're passing in 2 different arguments to console.log so that when it runs, it gives us a, you know, during iteration undefined. So what this tells us is that the very first iteration is where our error is. So the error is not like, you know, during the 4th iteration it did something inconvenient. It's every single time, including the first time, we messed up. And so we look in here and we think, okay, well, maybe I would go another console.log and say before if statement, and then do largest. And this would give me another indication of like, okay, before the if statement the first time I had negative infinity, and then during the iteration it was changed to undefined. So whereas it should have been changed to 1, it was changed to undefined. I come in here and see that, oh, I'm accidentally setting it equal to the length. I should probably get rid of that. So I do, I hit run, jackpot. It's also nice because if you log things to the console, they call it tactically like that, we can give ourselves a nice description of what's going on when the code eventually does work. If you find yourself looking at a problem that you can't solve for like weeks on end, never hesitate to go look at a solution, at least once. And then doing something like this to a solution that you don't understand can sometimes give you an inkling of like what's going on inside of that function and give you a hint of maybe something you could do to solve problems in the future or solve that problem if you come across it later. In general, they tend to get a little upset with you if you console.log everything and get confused. But if you console.log it, quote, tactically like this, I can't imagine why they would be upset. This is the only real debugging anybody has access to during the interview or the assessment. Also, that's another thing. When I say interview and assessment, I mean the same thing. They just keep changing the name of it, and, well, we've been over this. I'm not a big fan of change. In terms of learning a code editor as a beginner, never too early to download VS Code and start playing around with it. There's a ton of very useful things, and exactly what I'm doing here can probably, well, very likely be accomplished using VS Code. You would just have to look up some videos or do some tutorials, but that's never time that you're going to feel like you wasted, which is to say that software engineering is vast enough that just reading about things you're not aware of is a very, very good primer in case it comes up later. And if nothing else, it gives you practice on reading difficult things. So to that end, this entry on let, even though it's probably a little bit impenetrable for people who are brand new to coding, it never hurts to read it. Because it's like, okay, well, what does this mean? It's like, okay, well, that's their way of describing that this is the syntax, but this is an optional part of it. And as you can see, they kind of build up and say, this is optional, and you could also send it another one if you created another var definition. The problem with this is I don't like when people do this. I think this is a bad idea. I think it obscures what people are trying to get across. And what it is let's jump on down here. So what they'll say is you could say let A equal Q, let B equal J. You could write it like that. This says the same thing though. And it might not be the case immediately, but this might give an inclination or like a slight inkling as to why there are so many things where it's like, yeah, that's not in the prep course because you don't need to know about that yet. This is one of those. It's like, if you only know how to do this, everything that you'll need to be able to do for the interview and the assessment and even pre-course is going to be just fine. This is also available though. They mean identical operations. There's no difference between these two. However, that is not the same at all. This is not the same at all as this. They're completely different things. So it has to be with a comment between them. And you want to know how weird JavaScript is? I think that works the exact same way. It doesn't really pay attention to the lines as much as you think it should. But yeah. It's fun though. JavaScript can be kind of annoying to learn the first time, but it's a very useful language to start out with. Things tend to be a little bit easier in other languages, for the most part, but that's debatable. But JavaScript is also usable almost everywhere. Like you can use it in backend, front end, middleware. The whole 9 yards of the full stack can be taught using JavaScript. That's the main reason why we use it. It's popular, and that helps, but its ability for us as educators to say, learn this one language, and then we'll teach you everything about software engineering from the top to the bottom of the stack. Almost everything. The bottom of the stack gets very, very wide and diverse very quickly. So there are things that you won't learn about in Hack Reactor that is involved in backend engineering, but you'll have kind of like a primer of the ideas or the buckets, as it were, that those things are going to fit into. So cool. So let's get rid of all of this. Does Galvanize teach Docker? I don't know about that one. And I have a half explanation for why it's okay that I don't know about that. And it's because they change the curriculum all the time. And the reason they do is because if something becomes popular and is likely to get students jobs and fits into our paradigm of teaching, then they'll usually add it to the course. They want you to leave with the best appreciation of as much hireable skills as you can. It is entirely possible that they do teach Docker. And if they don't, they probably give you the tools needed so that you can use it yourself. Yeah, that's what I would say. I don't know if they exactly use it, though. I tried using it once, and it crashed my computer, so I stopped. But that's not to say anything about its utilities. The hardest thing has been reading the questions and comprehending what it's asking. I'm using accumulator pattern and it has helped in my problem solving. Are there any other patterns, tips, or tricks to start solving? What is your strategy? Two things. It's an excellent question. Well, that's three things. Excellent question. Two things that I use. One, try to solve a miniature version of the problem or a problem that you do understand that's kind of hidden in there. And this doesn't always work because sometimes it's like, well, I'm still as far away from understanding it, I just have some code written. Here's an idea. Let's say that you had to find the longest word in an array of words. I think that's somewhere in the prep course. So let's say you had to do that. Let's say that you don't know how to find out which word is the longest. But you probably do know that if you want to find the longest word, you probably have to look at all the words and compare them to each other somehow. So maybe solve the problem of looking at all the words and like logging them into the console. At that point, it might be a little bit easier to figure, okay, if I'm looking at this word, I can picture the comparison necessary to find out if this is the longest word more easily than I can figure out how to compare all of them and get the longest word for all of them all at once. So that's one version, is to solve a miniature version of the problem. The other one, which is my favorite, is pseudocode. You want to be able to describe in concise, clear English exactly what your code is doing, line by line. So most people come back and they're like, okay, well, I don't really know how to get started with that because I don't know what the code should say, so it's impossible for me to figure out how to write clear, concise English statements that describe code that I'm not aware of. It's like, excellent point. So to that end, pseudocode is something you do to code after you've written it, as a beginner, I should say. So once you've solved a couple problems in basic prep or anywhere, go back, look at those problems, and write out pseudocode for them. A lot of times you'll see me start with pseudocode or you write pseudocode before I solve a problem, but that's because I've been doing it for a while. If you're a beginner, solve the problem, hack and slash until you get through it, and then go and try to write pseudocode on top of what you've already written. That's usually the best way to try to, build a foundation on which you can solve future problems because you don't think in code. Most people, like, oh, I started programming and I had a dream in code, and that's awesome. Like, that's a very, very cool experience. But most people, especially when they're under stress, don't think in code. You think in English language statements. Or in pictures. I've heard some people think in pictures, but we're not going to worry about them just for the moment. And besides, we'll just say that the pseudocode is descriptions of the pictures they're thinking of. To that end, though, you want to avoid a situation where you write code that you're not 100% sure works. And if you do, you're better served if there's a line describing what that code does, so that if you're having trouble and you think you wrote the function correctly, you run it, it doesn't come out correctly, you can go back and compare the code to the pseudocode to see if it actually does what you think it should be doing. Most people do not love to delete code that they've written, but if you have pseudocode first, it's much easier because you can just say like, oh, okay, well that's not doing what I know should be done, so I'll just get rid of it. If that did not help, don't hesitate to watch the videos. Watching the videos of somebody solving the problems first can be a very, very good way to get yourself rolling. The pitfall there is you do not want to assume that you understand code just because you watch somebody else do it. You need to go back and make sure that you can write out the code yourself. Otherwise, you're going to leave yourself with an inflated perception of your coding skills. But that's not that happens to everybody. It's just like a natural tendency to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I could do that. But most of the time, if you can't generate it by yourself, it's not the case that you understand how to do it. But the middleware, the stopgap in between those two is pseudocode. Watch the video and see if you can get some pseudocode out of it, and then see if you can code on top of that. And also, just keep doing the problems. You want to figure that like there's a pattern to them that I tried to establish that sort of like loosens up as you get towards the later modules. Hopefully, that pattern is repeated enough that you start to get a sense of like, okay, I'm going to write a function. That function is going to have a name. That function is going to take in an assumed set of parameters that are going to have specific types. I'm going to do something to them, iterate, if statement, another variable, something. Then I'm going to return a value, or not. Once you start with that, it tends to be a little bit easier to picture what the problem's asking because they're all asking you to do that. It's like write a function that does something with these inputs. Any issue with using semicolons even though some statements don't require it? Yeah, so what I would say is that you are correct. You almost never need semicolons. They do end a line, but almost invariably JavaScript doesn't care if you end the line or not, provided that you don't. Here's the only situation where a semicolon is really going to get you in trouble, is that if you have a if you have some kind of statement that like ends, and then you have another statement that begins with a parentheses, it's going to think, do you see how it changed the highlighting of ends when I wrote there? That's because it thinks that you're calling ends now. If I put this here, now it doesn't. It thinks that this is just something else. Honestly, I've never come across that, but that was the reason that was given to me as to why it doesn't work. However, you'll also notice that there is no arrow functions in the course, and the reason is because arrow functions kind of break what I just said, and there's a bunch of things that happen implicitly with arrow functions that I just do not like messing with. So yeah, that would be what I would say with semicolons. In general, as a beginner though, what you want is to have zero variability in the way that you answer questions between your practice and the way that you take the interview. That's what the course is going for. It's going for, you will have everything that you need and you should be practicing it the exact same way so that when you get in trouble, which is to say during the interview, it's a shockingly like intrusive experience to be like, okay, go, let's see how smart you are. Because that's not what we're going to say, but that's how it feels, especially when you start screwing up a problem. Or just to say you start going down an avenue that might not be as promising as another one. And so if you do things like put semicolons at the end of every line and always have your if statements have curly braces, because one thing that you can do is if you have a one-line if statement, you can write it here and it'll work. But you can also always just write it, here. Now, here is not a function, it doesn't work like that, but this is the syntax of how you can write every if statement, but you can also do it this way. You can have it all on the same line if it's only one expression. The reason I don't teach people that is because why would you need to know that before you pass an interview? To me, that's in that nice, big, vast ocean of once you get into the program, there's so much fun stuff for you to learn and cool ways to mess with your code, and you're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So for now, let's not rock the boat too much. Let's make sure that we're able to effectively do what the interview/assessment needs us to do so you can get into the course and start enjoying things. I should say enjoying things. The course is certainly, enjoyable is not the word most people would use for it while they're in it, but afterwards people enjoy the time they spent. To the person who asked the semicolon question, if there is more that you were looking for, also same with the person who was asking about the other patterns and tricks and tips. If the answer I give is not sufficient, if it doesn't really address the question, please say something. And in Slack, but I am never going to be offended if it's that made no sense, because some explanations work for some people and some people need, slightly different explanations. A lot of times it comes down to finding a metaphor or mental model that helps you appreciate these things in a way that your mind can remember later. Okay, true or false? When iterating over objects, use for var key an object, and for arrays, use for var k. Please clarify the difference between the two iterations. Oh, that's nice and easy. They both work on arrays. So, sorry. Yeah, they both work on arrays. A for in loop and a for loop both work on arrays. A for loop, the one with the dot length thing, won't work on an object because the object doesn't necessarily have a length property. Because JavaScript is fun, there's also now something called a for of loop, which will let you iterate over an array using something very similar to a for in loop, but it's for of instead. Excellent idea. I will demonstrate that. Let's say A, B, C is usually a little easier than 1, 2, 3. Okay, so yeah, consistency is such a big favor that you're going to do yourself when it comes to the interview. Consistency is one of those things that, especially, that's why I'm so, I would call it militantly aggressive about indentation and proper spacing. If you space and indent everything the exact same way, you will almost never lose a curly brace. But if you just put them anywhere, you almost invariably will lose a curly brace, and it's going to drive you nuts because you'll have the correct answer, it'll keep saying you have an error, and what usually happens when you're missing a curly brace is, I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but it'll tell you that you have a missing end of input on line, and then it'll list a line that's 3 times longer than what you actually have written on the page. And essentially, that's JavaScript's interpreter doing you a favor and essentially saying, look, I checked twice as many lines as you have written here, and I can't find the end of this function, so I'm just going to stop here. It was line of 100. Good luck finding it, which makes me smile because it's kind of sassy. It's just I looked all the way to line 100. I couldn't find your stupid curly brace, so, But yeah, that's what's going on there. Okay, so we're talking about for in loops and for of loops. So we have both of these are going to work with for in loops. So we can say variable key in array, and we could console.log r at key. Now the cool part is that key is going to be assigned as 0, 1, and 2, because arrays in JavaScript are actually objects. And not objects the way that everything is an object, but objects in that when JavaScript was first written, it didn't have arrays, so they had to make an array-like object, but they keep replacing all of that. So this is one of those where it's weird. Okay, so let's run this one. We'll see ABC. And okay, so we can also do this of. Now, we want to change this from key to value, because it's actually value ends up being ABC. Right? Because it's like, why would you do that? And the reason is because a lot of other programming languages have a pattern like this, where you can say for value in an array, or for value of an array. So that's what's going on there. But JavaScript already had a for in loop, so they couldn't say for in, so that's why we get this. Did you define var key? Yes, it did. You can leave it off too. It won't matter if you leave it off. Well, it will. It'll create value as a global variable. So let's go through that. Because if we say let, there's another quick little version of let. But if we were to say let, or console.log value, we're going to get an error. If we change this to var, I think it's going to be C at the end. Yeah. So yeah, that's what's going on there. In general, to me, it is easier to use for loop with the dot length, is less than dot length or whatever, for arrays, and a for in loop for objects. The fun part about objects, though, is you almost never have to iterate over an object. An object is like defined as something which is like easier to look up a value inside of it. If you need to look at all of the values or all the keys in an object, you could use a for in loop. But in general, that just doesn't happen all that often. It would be an array if you needed to do something to all the values in it. Whereas if it's an object, it's usually like, well, the values are associated, like the way they would be if you were defining like a user. Whereas an array of users might have you do something to all users. You probably wouldn't go in and be like, give me all the information for the user. But you might, and if you did need to, then a for in loop would be an appropriate choice. Okay. I think that's all the questions that are going on right now. Semicolons or follows. Did that clarify the difference between the two iterations and why there really isn't that much of a difference, but it's the, dot length is what we're missing if we're trying to iterate over an object's values. Of course, since we're not inside of the prep course, we could always use object.keys, pass an object to it, and that's going to give you an array of all the keys in the object. And the same thing with values. It'll give you an array of all the values, which you could then iterate over. So it's like, to say that you need to take JavaScript and the lessons inside of it with a grain of salt is a bit of an understatement. JavaScript's, I don't know. It's kind of cool though. There are a lot of times when JavaScript can be very, very useful, and I don't know. I would say the biggest advantage of it is that you can learn all the parts of software engineering a web application using JavaScript, with a couple other languages kind of tossed in, but they're very, very easy to pick up. Sorry if it was a silly question. No, there are no silly questions. You'll notice that I say we're in good shape at the end of a lot of the videos. It's a habit that I got into. And then I noticed I did that, and so I started making jokes about that at the end of other videos. And people in these streams routinely make comments in the Slack channel asking me about my shape and whether it's good or not. And so, like, I'm all for that. The only issue I have is when people bother other students on the platform. You definitely want to be very, very careful DMing anybody. In fact, I would avoid it at all costs for the most part, unless you're friends and you've chatted about it and it's cool. But always feel free to poke one at me. I got thick skin for that kind of stuff. Yeah, no, I do too. I was watching the videos at one point and I was like, wow, I sound like I'm automated with that. Okay, we're in good shape. It's really difficult to end the videos. I never really know what to say. if you're looking for a way to kind of like supercharge your learning, which, you know what, we're just throwing that all the way out. There is no way to supercharge your learning. But one way to kind of focus your approach to Hack Reactor or Galvanize or any kind of coding bootcamp is start with an end date. Like, when do I want to attend the program, and what is the interview deadline for that? And then decide, I'm going to take an interview on day X. I used to do a thing called mentor prep, and that was the first thing we would do with students is, when are you trying to go to the course? You know, if you're trying to go. And if you are, let's sign up for an interview for a date that fulfills that requirement, and then put it on your calendar. And just every single day you're working closer to that goal of the interview. You know, if you get close and it's not looking like it's going to happen, you know, delay it, which is, there's no problem doing that, but it never hurts to give yourself this like boost of incremental like progress, as opposed to just, okay, just another problem down. The other thing is, I got to go in here and change this, because I'm realizing that people are not, what's it called, picking up what I'm putting down, as it were. There's a section in here, there's two sections. There's one called All the Problems and one called All the Docs. And what I meant for this to be was, it's like, you know, if you wanted to redo problems that you had done previously, or you watched the video and you wanted to try to do it yourself, then go ahead and use those. Please use recklessly. Yeah, this guy's got jokes. Anyway, what I mean by that is that you do not have to do these at all. And now that I think about it, I'm probably going to add a link here that just lets you go to the next module, because it's not like Module 1 is lacking for problems, you know. And in another sense, you can picture the courses almost in two distinct sections. It's like, learn what JavaScript is, and then practice it. And then Module 2 is like, all right, let's talk about how JavaScript applies to software engineering, and then let's talk about how you can get good at practicing for the interview, and then more of the same. Oh yeah, no, sales or talking to customers will definitely affect your like sign off when you're talking with family and stuff, and vice versa. Just, it's always weird. I always end calls with my mom and my dad with like, is there anything else I can help you with today? And they always kind of smile, because they'll always mention something ridiculous. They're like, yeah, no, we need you to... They live in Virginia, and I don't live anywhere near that, so they always make some joke about, like, you know, bringing the dog in, or, you know, some other kind of familial hilarity. But to be sure, for anybody watching who's new here, the only time that you hear me kind of like riff about random stuff is when people run out of questions, and it's not 7:30 yet. Because I usually stay on here for about an hour. I want to answer any questions that anybody has, but I also don't want to just bail and have somebody show up and be like, oh man, I thought he would have still been here. So yeah, if you have a question, please feel free to let me know. Also, if you're not comfortable chatting in the general channel about it, you can always send me a private message. I'm here on Slack as, you know, think David Coleman, it's all one word. Always feel free to send me a direct message. I cannot say that I'm going to be able to get to all of them if it ever picks up seriously. Because for the most part, there's not a ton of you all here for the live version. More people watch just the other videos or, you know, the stream afterwards. But that said, you know, I can appreciate that for somebody, especially if they're new, might not want to actually, you know, write their question for everybody to see just right in the middle of the general channel. So if that's the case, you have 100% permission to direct message. And, you know, I try to leave people's names out of it when I'm answering questions. So if there's ever like an awkward person who asked this question kind of thing, that's what I'm doing. I just don't want to put your name out there. Because, well, I'm not necessarily sure that everybody would be okay with that. And it's better to err on the side of caution. Performance exercises. My goodness. That is not how you spell that. Okay, we'll just scroll off of that for now. Cool. So, I think it's probably about time to pick a random problem. Ooh, hey, somebody's typing. That's reason enough to not pick out a random problem. Although we're now talking about performance exercises. Performance exercises. Good gravy. These ones are hard. In case you're curious, I tried to write that in there, but especially this one, divide and conquer, it's definitely not the kind of thing that you would need to be able to do for the interview. It's significantly harder. Mainly because throughout the entire prep course, we don't really delve into the idea of like efficiency of your code. You know, it's mostly just, can you do the substance of it? But eventually you are going to want to figure that it's like, if you're solving a problem that requires you to do to look at every value in an array twice, it is not necessarily as optimal if you only needed to look at maybe all the elements in the array once. Hey, can you touch on the syntax of splice? absolutely can touch on the syntax of Splice. Splice was actually one of the parts of the documentation that I'm particularly proud of. Mainly because all the docs portion was supposed to be used as like a set of docs. So the idea would be that you're working on a problem and you're not really sure how to use something like Splice. So you come over here to all the docs. And this is to give you like a primer of how to get better at using a thing like MDN without having to know, come on, yeah, what all this is. Because, you know, it's kind of intense. Anyway, all of the docs, we'll go ahead and hit Command F and we'll say Splice. So we've got a bunch of different things we can do with Splice. We can add an element in general, which is to say we can add an element somewhere. We can remove an element in general. We can remove and add elements. And that's it. So the syntax of Splice is, I think it's 4 total. No, it's three arguments to Splice. The first element is going to be the index of the item to be removed. So essentially you're saying from index 3, I want you to remove, and then this is the parameter that tells you how many you want to remove. So what we're saying here is, well, let's just bring it over to Replit. Okay, so we're going to run it, of course. You know what, I think that I'm going to do the other layout. Oh, geez, I don't know. Yeah, that'll be good for now. So Splice will let us remove, add, or remove and add elements. So the first element is the index that we want to start cutting. The second parameter or second argument is going to be the number of elements that you want to remove. So this so far is saying, hey, start cutting at 3, remove 1, 2 elements from the array, and then input, and again, it'll be at that same place where you started cutting, the values 4 and 5. So any arguments after the second are going to be values that you want to add in. So first argument is where to start cutting. Second argument is how many to start cutting. Third, fourth, fifth, those are all elements that you want to add in that same place. And I'll show you what I mean, because let's say that we change this to 0. If we change this to 0, we're now saying instead of cutting 2 elements, we're saying cut 0 elements. So rather than this as the result, we're going to get that as the result. So it's essentially going, start index 3, don't cut anything, add elements 4 and 5. So it takes 4 and 5, adds them before index 3, and then, or adds them at index 3, and then, doesn't do anything else. Let's say that we wanted to remove 3 elements. What we're going to notice is that it's going to clip 6 as well. So we'll end up with just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can also only add in 1 if we wanted to. Somebody asked me a cool question the other day. They were like, hey, so why would I not just use Splice? And why do pop, push, unshift, and shift exist? And I thought that was kind of interesting because, well, you probably could. It's another one of those where the situation is going to be dependent on enough factors that there is usually a need for there to be different methods for each one of those. To say that so that it doesn't sound like somebody is having a stroke while they're saying it, the context of what's going on in your problem can be very useful. And one of the contexts that's going to be going on for problems that you'll be solving as an engineer is another engineer on your team might need to know what you're doing. So if you use Splice for everything, it might be a little bit more difficult for people other than you. And people other than you include you 6 months after you wrote the code because you forget every part of it. It's paying attention to what will make things easier for them is a part of software engineering. So while Splice will get the job done for pretty much anything you need to do, because let's show that real quick. That might be kind of fun. So let's say that we wanted to use Splice to push an element to the end of this. We would want to start cutting at index 3, which is here. We would want to remove nothing, and we want to add added. So if we run this, that's the same as saying array.push added. So it does do the same thing, theoretically. Well, not theoretically, it does do the same thing. We can see it on the page. But if I look at this, I'm not 100% immediately sure right off the bat that that's what's happening. Whereas if I say .push, I can pretty quickly get to the bottom of what I'm trying to do there. Also, another thing you might notice is that Splice is destructive, which means that I say array.splice, it actually changes the array. Whereas if I was to use something like slice, Slice doesn't change the array. So let's say I said slice and I want to slice from 4 or 5. Let's say I want to slice from index 1 to index 3. You're going to notice that nothing happens to the array. What I need to do is I need to say something like variable slice is equal to, and then set that equal to the result of this expression. That's going to allow me to create a new instance, or sorry, a new array that's a result of slicing our initial array from some index to another index. This will also let you make a copy of an array if that ever comes up. You ever want to make a copy of an array, just say slice without any parameters, and it'll give you a nice clean copy. Good question, though. Splice is a, well, I don't know. I like Splice, but I can picture why it would be very difficult to understand, especially if you don't, have somebody walk it through like that, where it's like, okay, so this is exactly what it's up to and why. A lot of things in programming are like that, and I feel like a lot of people see something of that ilk, where it's like, I don't understand this, but a lot of people seem to, and they decide that they won't be a good programmer because of that, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. Software engineering is a really nice entry into the world of tech because there's just so many different parts of it, And just because you're not world class at one part of it that people on the internet seem to be indicating is, necessary, has nothing to do with somebody hiring you to do a job for them. Like what a place like Hack Reactor or Galvanize does is gives you a set of skills to approach a company with rather than a set of credentials. The credential of going to a boot camp, I guess, is a thing, or is of some value to some people and of less value to other people, but it's the skills. You go and you say, hey, I worked on these 3 projects. It took me this much time to get tuned up on it. Here's an example of my solving a problem that you as an engineering team are going to have, and I can start solving them effectively tomorrow because of the adherence to software engineering, not just code that goes on in a place like Hack Reactor. S. Okay. I'm not sure what to do with that. If it's a typo, that's totally cool. If you have a question that starts with an S, I wait with bated breath. Mistake. Okay, cool. I could delete that for you if you wanted, but I don't know. Can you all delete messages? I never can tell, just because I've never been a user here. Okay, so there's a question in a direct message. I'm going to try to kind of translate. The question is worded well. I just want to make sure that everybody gets a sense of what's going on. The error that seems to be coming out is that it says some variable is not a function. What usually is happening there, I think, is that you might be reassigning some variable to be something that it's not. Or you might be assuming that it was reassigned to something that it's not, because especially if you're trying to use slice to solve like the how long is a string without using length question, part of it usually involves your reassigning a value to be that value sliced. If you don't do that and you try to slice it again, sometimes you can get that error. Usually if it says something is not a function, it's because you have assigned a value that was usable with slice to a value that is not usable with slice. So let me show you what I mean. Let's say that for some reason I decide to say our array is equal to, what can I not use slice on? 71. So if I do that and try to call slice, it's going to say array.slice is not a function. And the reason that it's not is because array is now a value of 71, and 71 does not have, and forgive me for this, as part of its prototype chain, which means to say methods that are available to it as a consequence of its type, it doesn't have a slice method, whereas array does. Array does have a slice that is automatically available. That's something called the prototype chain. Basically just means all arrays are allowed to use a method called slice. It'll do this to the array and do this as a result. 71 is a number, and so .slice is not inherently a part of the value 71. So when we say array.slice and then say it's a function, the interpreter is like, no, it's not. Even though to us it looks like, yes, it is, array.slice is a total function, but what's usually happening under the hood is that you've created array as a value that does not have a slice method. I hope that helps. If that does not, person who DM'd me, please feel free to send another question or, a snippet or, just chit chat until it gets clear for you. Does unshift? What is a typical day at work as a software engineer? I would not know. I am very, very loosely a software engineer. Much more of like a math guy. However, I would imagine that there's a ton of videos like that you could probably find. Most of the time it has something to do with like stand-ups, and you talk with your team, and there's projects that you'll be working on. It depends a lot on the size of company, the style of project you're working on, the members of your team. A very loose definition could be you are the person that helps solve difficult problems, and the order and the chaos surrounding that is very dependent on the context of where you're doing that solving. Trying to think if there's somebody who'd be very, very good for that. Like a YouTube channel. I would just Google that. What's a day of life what's a typical day at work for a software engineer? And then make sure you watch more than like 2 or 3 videos. Because somebody will be like, hey, this is what a typical day in the life of a software engineer is. And it'll be their typical day. But the problem with that is that might differ significantly from somebody else's. A good version of it would be, you might want to check out what a contractor does, what somebody at a small startup does as a software engineer, and then what somebody does at a major company, because those are all going to vary very, very widely. Hope that helps. Also, I hope I haven't lost your good opinion by the admission that I'm not really a software engineer. Does .unshift do the same as splice/push, or is it only for arrays? Well, push is going to do the exact opposite of unshift. Push is going to allow you to add a value to the end of an array. Unshift is going to allow you to add an element to the beginning of an array. Splice, we were kind of demonstrating, can do all of that. Splice could add an element to the beginning of an array, it could remove an element from the beginning of an array, it can add an element to the end of an array, and it can remove an element from the end of the array. It just has to do with the variability of splice. The unshift question, does that answer your question? And the typical day at work as a software engineer, I'd have to imagine that Hack Reactor and Galvanize does like webinars and has videos about that. They tend to be pretty conscientious about that. My videos are mostly just like, here's how you solve the problems. Oh, excellent. Person on the DM has thumbs up. Ah, excellent. Would it help if we go over like the shift, unshift, push? How often do you use these? I almost never use splice unless I'm trying to do something to like the middle of an array, like to change out values. If I'm adding something to the beginning, taking something off the end, removing something. The problem that you have with splice is that you have to tell it the exact, what is it called? The exact index that you want to be cutting. You can get around that by using the length, but the length changes if you change the length of the array. So it can get a little bit tricky, and sometimes it's easier to just say, just use pop. Pop is always going to give you the last value in the array, whereas splice might mess up if you're not perfectly precise, I should say, with your length. Because a lot of times people will solve the problem where it's like you have to get rid of a value. Like you want to iterate over an array of values, and if you see a certain target value, you get rid of it. And people will use splice for that. The problem is that they don't remember to change the value of I. If they're using a for loop, the value of I will still think that the length is a certain value, but if you remove something, you'll end up skipping a value if you don't change it. Oh, the live stream office hours. Usually every Wednesday. Excuse me. It's Wednesday at 6:30 Central Time, but it was mainly I just said, hey, I'm going to do this, and then nobody really stopped me. So there's some people on the marketing team that are helping me out with it, sending emails to people, but for the most part, I just wanted to sort of hang out and see what it looks like. They're once a week right now. I would have to imagine if they pick up and become popular, they'll get some more people to do this just because, well, I'm just not that good at this stuff. Okay, we got a question and a DM. Oh, excellent. Excuse me. This is not a question that's like a, hey, let's, excuse me, answer things in a public thing. That was just somebody who was in the position that you all are in that has since gotten into the course and was writing to say thank you. You're most welcome. Very, very delighted to hear. What is going on? Give me back my... Oh, you. Well, let's just leave it. I think this usually means that somebody's forking it, and I don't want to mess them up if they're forking it. You can always feel free to do that. If you type in @Lovelace Turing, what is it, dutiful generic, when you create a new replit, it actually gives you a randomly generated title. Oh boy, I think I'm frozen here. Sorry, I think we're going to have to refresh. Actually, I think there's some time to go back to the general channel and see some other questions. Be kind to yourself. Oh, I am extraordinarily kind to myself. It's a self-deprecating humor approach. Thank you very much for saying that. And for all of you out there, it's very important not to put yourself down. But yeah, don't worry about me. I'm mostly joking when it comes to most of that stuff. All right, well, you've officially lost my patience, or run out, or whatever. Hey, we're back. If somebody was forking that and it messed it up, sorry, just try to fork it again. Thank you for taking the time. What is going on there? There we go. Thank you for taking the time. Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm telling you, I thoroughly enjoyed doing this part. I think that one of the most fun parts of people's journey on learning to be software engineers is the very beginning, when they think they don't have any skills, but they've been successfully programming themselves through life the entire time. And so a lot of times it just comes down to, well, there's two things. One is it is not the case that you won't be good at this just because the first set of tutorials didn't really click for you. However, you do want to get a sense of if it's something that captures your interest. Like, does the time fall off the clock when you're doing these tutorials and messing around with the console and messing around with websites and learning new stuff? If the time starts falling off of the clock, you are set. It's like, okay, more practice, diligent note-taking, and organization will lead you to a very well-paying job and a fulfilling career there afterwards. If you don't, you're going to hate all of this because it is mostly what we're up to in the prep course. It gets more complicated, the scope gets larger, there's more details to consider, and it's more fun because the details get wider, but it will be a lot of the reading documentation and trying things until they work, and having long discussions about the efficacy of one approach versus the other, because what is the best way to? There is no best way to. There is usually, almost universally, a trade-off between two different versions. Something will cost more, something will cost less, something's easier to understand but more difficult to write. It'll be faster, but it might be more error-prone. There's tons of different considerations, and for people who become successful software engineers and successful with this stuff, that stuff is, just, you'll love it. You can't get enough of it. I had one person that went through the program as a friend of mine, and he ended up getting a job at, after a while, he got a job at Microsoft, and he got put on a team where his code was being reviewed by the chief architect of Microsoft. It's just the way that they do stuff there. And he used to talk about he would get stuck in conversations with this guy for just hours, just going over, well, why would we set it up like this? And so what an architect does is define a system that the engineers use. So it's almost like meta programming. And he just thought that was the best thing ever. And, I would not want to do that. So that's something that you're also going to want to consider. To be sure, though, describing back-end processes for hours at a time is not the only way to be a software engineer. The entire world of front-end stuff. In fact, there's a really cool website called CodePen. CodePen is another place where we used to have our stuff. CodePen. This is a great website, especially for front-end developers. If you want to get some cool ideas about what you can do here, this is a really fun website. You can open up somebody's project and just be like, okay, well, let's look at what their code looks like. And this is the code that makes that happen on a website. Which I think that's cool. But that said, well, there is no that said. That's just another avenue. A lot of times people will think that the best way to learn about software engineering is to get all deep into algorithms, but another way is just be like, well, let's look at pretty pictures. Well, so it is 7:32, and my computer is making that noise that it makes when I'm running too much RAM because I have an ancient computer that I'm really loath to replace. I actually have replaced it. I just don't like to use the new ones because my fingers are very familiar with where the keys are. But that said, it is about to start doing that thing where it's like, please stop using all of my RAM. So I'm probably going to wrap up the stream now. And for those of you who haven't been here before, when I say that, it means get your final questions in, and we'll sort those out before we leave, because I would not want you guys to. That is very much appreciated. I love hanging out with y'all. It is one of the most fun things that I get to do, so very much appreciated for anybody who got some utility out of this. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me a direct message, chat on the general channels. What was the last part? Yeah, I'm always bad at the end of these. No, that's pretty much it. There'll probably be another one of these next week at 6:30. If there's any problems that you've come across that you want me to do, if there's anything that you think would be nice to add to the course, always delighted to hear anybody's opinions about all that. I want to hear about errors that you find in the course, anything that doesn't seem like it's in the right place. There's almost nothing that I wouldn't want to hear from students going through the course. If you don't like it, tell me, and why, because the entire aim of our course is to provide a completely free way for anybody who wants to get better at code and possibly head towards a coding bootcamp if that's something they want to do. So if there's something with the way that the course has been designed or something that's going on that's preventing that, please let us know, because almost none of what's in the course is ironclad, and you can always add in extra sections and things like that. So from everyone here at my apartment, which is just me, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you next week. Probably be a second here before I find out how to turn off the stream, but that's okay.